I stood at the counter of this stylish Manhattan coffee shop, clutching my last bills, imagining the warm coffee and donut I'd been dreaming about all week. But when the barista named the price, I was $2 short. Before I could explain, his cold voice cut in. "If you can't pay, don't waste our time." And then the real humiliation began. I'd been in New York for 2 years, chasing a dream that felt further away every day. My name's Javier Morales, and at 24, I was splitting my life between two worlds. By day, I hauled boxes at a warehouse in Brooklyn, my back aching from lifting crates of produce in a sweaty, dusty haze. By night, I was a student, hunched over textbooks in a cramped apartment studying architecture. I wanted to design buildings, tall, gleaming ones like the ones I saw on Manhattan's skyline. That was my ticket to proving I wasn't just some nobody from a small town in Mexico. Back home, my mom used to say hard work would open any door, so I worked. I showed up early, stayed late, kept my head down. But New York didn't care. People saw my brown skin, heard my accent, and decided who I was before I opened my mouth. At the warehouse, guys called me Mexico, like it was my name. At school, professors barely noticed me unless I aced a test. I learned to stay quiet, to blend in, to be invisible. It was easier that way. Still, I had this fire inside, this need to belong. I'd walk past those shiny coffee shops and restaurants watching people laugh, sip drinks, live lives that seemed so easy. I wasn't jealous, not exactly. I just wanted a piece of it. A moment where I wasn't the guy who didn't fit. A coffee and a donut, that's all I asked for. Something small to make me feel like I was part of this city, not just scraping by in it. But every day I felt that wall, between me and them, between who I was and who I wanted to be. And no matter how hard I worked, it never seemed to budge. That morning, I decided to treat myself. I'd been grinding at the warehouse all week, my hands sore from lifting boxes, my mind numb from late-night study sessions. I wanted something normal, something that'd make me feel like I belonged in New York. So I walked into this sleek coffee shop on Manhattan's Upper East Side, all glass walls and polished chrome. The place smelled like fresh espresso and warm pastries. And for a second, I let myself imagine I was just another guy grabbing a coffee. I picked out a glazed donut from the display, its sugary shine calling my name, and ordered a black coffee to go with it. I stepped up to the counter, my last few bucks, 7 crumpled dollars, ready in my hand. The barista, a lanky guy with a smug grin, rang me up. "That'll be $9, he said, his voice flat, but loud enough for the whole place to hear. My stomach dropped. I was $2 short. I fumbled in my pocket, hoping for a miracle, but all I found was lint. Maybe just the coffee then," I mumbled, my accent thicker than I wanted. The barista rolled his eyes. "If you don't have the money, don't waste our time," he said, leaning forward like he was scolding a kid. The air in the shop shifted. People in line behind me, suits, fancy coats, perfect hair, started whispering. A woman in a sharp blazer, maybe 40, sighed loudly and checked her watch, like I was holding up her whole day. I felt my face burn, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to laugh it off, saying, "Guess I miscalculated," but the words sounded weak, and the barista just smirked. "Yeah, happens when you don't plan," he shot back. The whispers grew louder, and I caught the woman muttering to the guy next to her. "Why do they even come here?" Her words hit like a punch, and I knew they meant people like me. Brown skin, accent, faded jacket. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the shiny floor and never come back. My hands shook as I stuffed the useless bills back in my pocket. Every eye in that place felt like a spotlight, burning through me, telling me I didn't belong. The donut and coffee, that little dream of normal, turned sour in my mind. It wasn't just about the money. It was about them deciding I wasn't worth their time, their space, their city. I stood there, frozen, knowing this moment was about to get worse, and I wasn't wrong. I stood there at the counter, my crumpled $7 useless in my pocket, the barista's words, "Don't waste our time," still ringing in my ears. The coffee shop with its sleek glass and humming chatter felt like a trap closing around me. My cheeks burned, and I could feel every pair of eyes drilling into me, picking me apart. The barista, whose name tag read Tyler, leaned back, arms crossed, and raised his voice just enough to make sure everyone heard. "Look, man, if you can't afford it, maybe stick to places that fit your budget." His smirk was sharp, like he was enjoying this, like I was some kind of show for the morning crowd. The woman in the blazer behind me let out a loud huff, her heels clicking as she stepped closer to the counter. "Some people shouldn't be holding up the line," she said, her voice crisp and cutting, like she was scolding an employee. She looked me up and down, my faded jacket, my scuffed sneakers, and added, "Maybe you'd feel more comfortable in your own neighborhood." The way she said "your" made my stomach twist. It wasn't just about the $2 I was missing. It was about my brown skin, my accent, the way I didn't match the polished vibe of this place. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words stuck, heavy and useless in my throat. The whispers around me grew louder, like a swarm of bees. A guy in a suit muttered something about entitlement to his friend, who nodded without looking up from his phone. I caught the eye of an Asian kid, maybe a college student like me, sitting at a table with his laptop. His face softened for a second, like he got it, like he'd felt this kind of sting before. But then he looked away, back to his screen, and that hurt almost as much as the barista's words. It was like he wanted to help but didn't dare, and his silence made me feel even more alone. An older guy, maybe 60, with gray hair and a nice coat, stood near the counter, watching. His eyes had this flicker of pity, but he didn't say a word. He just sipped his coffee, his face tight, like he was sorry but not sorry enough to do anything. That look, sympathy, without action, cut deeper than the woman's snark. It was like he was saying, "Tough break, kid," but leaving me to drown in it. The whole place, the shiny counters, the smell of espresso, the clink of cups, it all screamed that I didn't belong, that I was an intruder who dared to want a donut and a coffee. My hands shook as I shoved them in my pockets, trying to hold it together. I wanted to yell, to tell them I was a student, that I worked harder than any of them probably ever had, that I wasn't just some broke loser. But the weight of their stares, their whispers, their judgment, it crushed me. I felt small, like I was shrinking right there in front of them. The donut in the display case, the one I'd wanted so bad, mocked me now, its sugary glaze glinting under the lights. It wasn't food anymore. It was a reminder that I'd never be one of them, no matter how hard I tried. My heart pounded, a mix of shame and anger boiling inside, and I knew I had to get out before I lost it completely. But even as I turned toward the door, I could feel their eyes following me, branding me as the guy who didn't measure up. I stumbled out of that coffee shop, the glass door swinging shut behind me with a soft thud that felt final, like it was locking me out of their world for good. The Manhattan street was loud, horns blaring, people rushing past in their polished shoes. But I barely noticed. My chest was tight, my face still hot, from the shame of being called out by that barista, Tyler, and the woman in the blazer whose words kept replaying, "Your own neighborhood." My hands were balled into fists in my pockets, the crumpled $7 digging into my palm. I wanted to scream, to run back in and tell them they were wrong about me. But what good would that do? They'd already decided who I was. I walked a few blocks, my sneakers scuffing the pavement, until I stopped under the shadow of a towering skyscraper. Its steel and glass gleamed in the morning sun, all sharp lines and quiet strength, everything I wanted to build someday. I stared up at it, my breath shaky, and something clicked. I was done being invisible, done letting people like Tyler or that woman make me feel like I didn't belong. That moment in the coffee shop wasn't just about $2. It was about a system that said I wasn't worth a seat at the table, and I wasn't going to let it win. Back in my tiny apartment that night, I couldn't sleep. The humiliation burned, but it was turning into something else, anger, maybe even purpose. I grabbed a notebook, the one I used for sketching building designs, and started writing down what happened. Every word Tyler said, the woman's sneer, the way the Asian student looked away, the old man's pity. It wasn't just my story. I knew others had felt this too. People who didn't look right, sound right, or have enough cash to pass the unspoken test of places like that coffee shop. I started talking to guys at the warehouse, guys like me who'd come from somewhere else, who'd been stared at or brushed off. One dude, Miguel, told me about getting kicked out of a diner for looking suspicious. Another guy, Carlos, said a store clerk followed him around like he was going to steal something. Their stories hit hard. They were like mine, different details, but the same sting. I didn't stop there. At school, I started paying attention to the other students who kept their heads down, the ones who didn't talk much in class. There was this one guy, Wei, the Asian student I'd seen in coffee shops and libraries, always quiet but sharp. I caught him after class one day, my heart pounding as I asked if he'd ever felt out of place in the city. He hesitated, then nodded, telling me about a time he got laughed at for his accent in a bookstore. It was like that moment in the coffee shop when our eyes met. He got it. He didn't say much, but he started sitting with me in the library, listening as I talked about what happened. He wasn't ready to speak up, but he was there, and that mattered. Then there was Professor Coleman, this older black guy who taught my urban design class. I never talked to him outside of lectures, but one day I stayed late, my notebook full of scribbled stories in my bag. I told him about the coffee shop, about the other guys' experiences, about how it wasn't just one bad day, but a pattern. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady, and said, "Javier, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. But you can be the one who does something about it." He didn't sugarcoat it. He said change was slow, messy, and hard. But he gave me a list of campus groups working on social justice. One of them, a student-led project on urban inequality, felt like the right place to start. I showed up to their next meeting, my palms sweaty, feeling like I was walking into another place I didn't belong. But the group, mostly students like me, some immigrants, some not, listened. I told my story, then Miguel's, then Carlos's. A girl named Aisha, who wore a hijab and had a fire in her voice, said she'd been turned away from a job interview because of cultural fit. We started pooling our stories, writing them down, sharing them online. Wei even helped me set up a group chat to keep it organized. It wasn't big yet, just a handful of us, but it felt like a spark. My anger, that shame from the coffee shop, it was turning into fuel. I wasn't just fighting for me anymore. I was fighting for all of us who'd been made to feel small, and I knew this was only the beginning. The weeks after that coffee shop disaster felt like I was carrying a weight in my chest, but it wasn't just shame anymore. It was purpose. I couldn't shake the memory of Tyler's smirk or that woman's sharp words, but instead of letting it crush me, I let it push me. I'd started something with that notebook, scribbling down stories from guys at the warehouse, from Wei, from anyone who'd felt that same sting of being pushed out. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us who'd been made to feel like we didn't belong, like we were less than human because of our skin, our accents, or the money we didn't have. I kept showing up to those student group meetings on campus, the ones Professor Coleman pointed me to. The room was small with chipped tables and flickering fluorescent lights, but it felt alive. Aisha, the girl with the hijab, was always there, her voice fierce as she shared how she'd been passed over for jobs because of her headscarf. Wei started opening up too, talking about the bookstore incident and how he'd stopped going to certain places to avoid the stares. Others chimed in, students from Nigeria, India, the Bronx, each with a story about being treated like they didn't fit. I'd read my notes aloud, my voice shaky at first, describing the coffee shop, the way the air felt heavy with judgment. Every time I spoke, it got a little easier, like I was taking back a piece of myself. One night, after a meeting, Aisha pulled me aside in the hallway, the smell of old coffee lingering from the machine in the corner. "Javier, we need to do more than talk in this room," she said, her eyes intense. "People need to hear this outside." She was right. We'd been sharing stories, but they were just words on paper until someone else listened. So we started a blog. Nothing fancy, just a free site Wei set up. We called it Unseen Stories, and we posted everything. My coffee shop moment, Miguel's diner rejection, Aisha's job rejections. I wrote about the way Tyler's voice cut through me, how the woman's comment about my neighborhood felt like a shove. Each post was raw, like ripping off a bandage, but it felt good to get it out. The blog started small, just a few dozen views, mostly from other students. But then something happened. A girl in our group, Priya, had a cousin who wrote for a local news site. She sent him our stories, and he reached out to me. We met at a diner in Brooklyn, the kind with sticky booths and endless coffee refills. His name was Sam, a skinny guy with glasses who typed fast while I talked. I told him everything, not just my story, but the pattern. How it wasn't one coffee shop, one barista, one bad day. It was every day for people like us. Sam listened, nodding, his pen scratching across his notebook. "This could be big," he said, his voice quiet but serious. "But I need more." So I dug deeper. I went back to the warehouse, talked to more guys. Carlos told me about a bar where the bouncer wouldn't let him in because he didn't look like their crowd. Another guy, Juan, said he'd been overcharged at a deli, like they assumed he wouldn't notice. I started noticing it everywhere. Cafes, stores, restaurants, places with unwritten rules about who belonged and who didn't. Wei and I spent nights combing through online reviews, finding complaints about rude staff or weird vibes at fancy spots across Manhattan. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. People with accents, darker skin, or cheaper clothes got the cold shoulder, or worse. Sam's article came out a month later, titled "The Cost of Exclusion: Everyday Discrimination in New York's Service Industry." My story was in it, anonymized as a young Mexican student, but the details were there: the coffee shop, the $2, the woman's sneer. It wasn't just about me, though. Sam had interviewed others, including Aisha and Miguel, and dug up data on how certain businesses screened customers based on appearance or ability to pay. The article blew up, shared across social media, picked up by bigger outlets. People started commenting, adding their own stories. A black woman wrote about being ignored at a high-end bakery. A Latino delivery guy said he'd been refused service at a cafe because he looked like a worker. It was like a dam breaking. People who'd stayed quiet were finally speaking. Our student group grew. We started hosting open forums on campus, inviting anyone to share their experiences. The room was packed. Students, locals, even a few professors. I stood at the front, my heart pounding, and told my story again, this time to strangers. I described the coffee shop, the way the donut in the case turned from a dream to a knife in my gut. People nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Aisha spoke next, her voice steady, calling out the systems that let this happen. Wei, who'd been so quiet before, talked about his bookstore moment, his words slow but clear. The energy in the room was electric, like we were building something unstoppable. Then we got a break. A local advocacy group reached out wanting to partner with us. They'd been tracking discrimination in businesses and had data, actual numbers, showing how certain chains, including the one that owned my coffee shop, had patterns of complaints tied to race and class. They'd even found employee training manuals that emphasized upscale customer experience, which was code for pushing out anyone who didn't look wealthy. It was proof, hard proof, that this wasn't just bad apples like Tyler. It was a system baked into the way these places operated. The story kept growing. More articles came out, some with headlines like "New York's Hidden Barriers" or "Who Gets to Belong." A TV news segment featured our group, with Aisha and me talking about how small moments, like a coffee shop rejection, add up to something bigger. I felt exposed, standing under those bright studio lights, but I also felt strong. My shame from that day, the way I'd wanted to disappear, was turning into something else. A voice. A weapon. People were listening now, not just to me, but to everyone who'd been invisible. And for the first time, I realized my story wasn't just a story. It was the start of a conversation that could change things. The buzz from our story didn't fade. It grew louder. After Sam's article hit, and then the TV segment, people weren't just talking, they were angry. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #UnseenStories and #NoMoreBarriers. I'd scroll through my phone at night, my tiny apartment lit by the screen's glow, reading comments from strangers who'd felt the same sting I did in that coffee shop. It wasn't just me anymore. It was a movement. But I kept waiting for something real to happen, something that would make that day with Tyler and the woman in the blazer feel less like a scar. I didn't want revenge. I wanted proof that I mattered. A few weeks later, I got a message from Aisha. "Check the news," she wrote, with a link to an article. My heart skipped as I clicked it. The headline read, "Manhattan Coffee Chain Faces Backlash Over Discrimination Claims." The story mentioned our blog, our campus forums, and the advocacy group's data. It named the coffee shop Brew and Bean, that shiny place where I'd been humiliated. Turns out dozens of people had come forward with similar stories. Rude staff, cold shoulders, outright rejections, all tied to race or class. The article said the chain's owner, a woman named Elaine Carter, was under pressure to respond. I felt a spark of hope, but I wasn't holding my breath. Then it happened. I was walking to class, my backpack heavy with architecture books, when Wei texted me a screenshot. It was a statement from Brew and Bean's social media. "We are deeply sorry for any experiences that made our customers feel unwelcome. The employee involved in the recent incident has been terminated, and we are reviewing our policies to ensure inclusivity." My hands shook as I read it. Tyler was gone. Fired. I stopped on the sidewalk, people brushing past me, and stared at the words. It wasn't just about him. It was about that moment. The one that made me feel like nothing, being called out for what it was. Wrong. A few days later, I saw Elaine Carter's face on the news. She stood outside the coffee shop, cameras flashing, her voice tight as she spoke. "We failed our customers," she said, her eyes darting to the side like she didn't want to be there. "We're implementing mandatory training for all staff and revising our hiring practices to prevent this from happening again." I watched it on my phone, sitting on my lumpy couch, the smell of leftover rice in the air. Part of me wanted to cheer, but another part felt heavy. Her apology sounded like it was forced, like she was saving her business, not fixing a problem. Still, it was something. More than I'd expected when I walked out of that shop, my head down, feeling like I didn't belong. The real change came slower, but it came. Our student group partnered with the advocacy organization to push for citywide initiatives. They called it the Fair Service Pledge, a program where businesses committed to anti-discrimination training and transparent complaint processes. Brew and Bean signed on, along with a dozen other chains. I went to a launch event at City Hall, standing in a crowded room with Aisha, Wei, and a bunch of people I didn't know. A councilwoman shook my hand, saying, "Your story started this." I didn't know what to say. My throat got tight, and I just nodded. For the first time, I felt seen, not as that Mexican kid or the broke guy, but as Javier, someone who'd made a difference. It wasn't perfect. Some businesses dragged their feet, and I still heard stories of people getting sidelined in fancy places. But the coffee shop incident wasn't just my pain anymore. It was a crack in the system, letting light in. I'd walk past Brew and Bean sometimes, its glass windows still gleaming, but it didn't feel like a fortress anymore. I didn't go back inside, not yet, but knowing Tyler was gone, knowing they had to answer for it, made me stand a little taller. For me, it was about dignity. Not just getting an apology, but knowing my voice had weight. I'd spent so long feeling invisible, like my dreams of being an architect, of building something lasting, were silly in a city that kept pushing me out. But now I'd built something else, a conversation, a change, a chance for people like me to be heard. That day with the coffee and donut, the one that broke me, also woke me up, and I wasn't going back to being quiet. A year later, I stood in a sleek office on the edge of Brooklyn, my tie a little too tight, my palms sweaty as I shook hands with my new boss. I'd done it, finished my degree, and landed a job as a junior architect at a small firm. The office smelled like fresh paint and coffee, and from the window I could see the city's skyline, all those buildings I'd dreamed of designing. It wasn't a corner office or anything fancy, but it was mine, a real step toward the life I'd fought for. Every time I sketched a blueprint, my pencil scratching across the paper, I felt like I was proving something, not just to New York, but to myself. But that day in the coffee shop, the one with Tyler's smirk and the woman's cold words, never left me. I could still feel the heat in my cheeks, the weight of those stares, the way that donut turned into a symbol of everything I wasn't allowed to have. It wasn't just a bad memory. It was the fire that got me here, so I didn't stop at my own win. I wanted to make sure others didn't have to feel that same sting, that same sense of being pushed out. I started a program with Aisha and Wei, something we called Open Doors. It was small, just a volunteer gig at first, but it grew. We worked with community centers to help migrants and low-income students navigate the city, finding jobs, dealing with landlords, even just knowing their rights. I'd sit with kids like me, guys who'd come from nowhere with big dreams, and tell them about the coffee shop, about how I turned that shame into something else. Their eyes would light up, not because I was some hero, but because they saw themselves in my story. One kid, Diego, told me he'd been laughed at in a store for counting change too slowly. I helped him write it down, share it, make it part of the fight. Sometimes, walking home through Brooklyn, the streetlights buzzing above me, I'd think back to that day at Brew and Bean. It still hurt, but it wasn't just pain anymore. It was the moment I stopped being invisible. I wasn't just a guy who couldn't afford a coffee. I was Javier Morales, architect, organizer, someone who'd turned a couple missing dollars into a voice for others. The city still had its walls, its fancy places that looked at me sideways, but I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I'd built my own space, and I was helping others do the same. As I look back on that day in the coffee shop, the sting of it still lingers, but so does the strength it gave me. I'm standing here now, not just as Javier, but as someone who found a way to turn shame into something bigger. And I want to thank you, every one of you listening, for sticking with me through this story. You didn't just hear my words, you felt them, maybe even saw yourself in them. Your time, your attention. It means the world to someone like me, someone who's spent so long feeling unseen. Knowing you're out there, listening, sharing, maybe even nodding along, makes this fight feel less lonely. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here, for caring enough to hear me out. Now, I've got a few questions for you because this isn't just my story, it's ours. Have you ever walked into a place and felt like you didn't belong, like the room itself was pushing you out? Maybe it was a store, a restaurant, or even a classroom, somewhere that made you feel small because of who you are, how you look, or what you could afford. What did that moment do to you? Did it make you shrink, or did it light a fire like it did for me? And here's another one. What's one thing you've done, or want to do, to stand up to unfairness, whether it's for yourself or someone else? I'd love to hear your stories, your fights, your wins. Drop them in the comments, share them with someone, or just think about them. Because every story we tell, every voice we raise, chips away at those invisible walls.